"Do you believe in ghosts?" I asked Runciman. I had to ask him this very platitudinous question, more because he was so difficult a man to spend an hour with than for any other reason. You know his books, perhaps, or more probably you don't know them. The Running Man, The Elm Tree, and Crystal and Candlelight. He is one of those little men who are constant enough in this age of immense overproduction of books. Men who publish every autumn their novel, who arouse by that publication in certain critics eager appreciation and praise, who have a small and faithful public, whose circulation is very small indeed, who, when you meet them, have little to say, are often shy and nervous, pessimistic and remote from daily life. Such men do fine work, are made but little of in their own day, and perhaps 50 years after their death are rediscovered by some digging critic, and become a sort of cult with a new generation. I asked Runciman that question because, for some unknown reason, I had invited him to dinner at my flat, and was now faced with a long evening filled with that most tiresome of all conversations, talk that dies every 2 minutes, and has to be revived with terrific exertions. Being myself a critic, and having on many occasions praised Runciman's work, he was the more nervous and shy with me. Had I abused it, he would perhaps have had plenty to say. He was that kind of man. But my question was a lucky one. It roused him instantly. His long bony body became full of a new energy. His eyes stared into a rich and exciting reminiscence. He spoke without pause, and I took care not to interrupt him. He certainly told me one of the most astounding stories I have ever heard. Whether it was true or not, I cannot, of course, say. These stories are nearly always at second or third hand. I had at any rate the good fortune to secure mine from the source. Moreover, Runciman was not a liar. He was too serious for that. He himself admitted that he was not sure, at this distance of time, as to whether the thing had gained as the years passed. However, "It was some 15 years ago," he said. "I went down to Cornwall to stay with Robert Lunt. Do you remember his name? No, I suppose you do not. He wrote several novels, some of those half-and-half things that are not quite novels, not quite poems, rather mystical and picturesque, and are the very devil to do well. De la Mare's Return is a good example of that kind of thing. I had reviewed somewhere his last book, and reviewed it favourably, and received from him a really touching letter, showing that the man was thirsting for praise, and also, I fancied, for company. He lived in Cornwall somewhere on the sea-coast, and his wife had died a year ago. He said he was quite alone there, and would I come and spend Christmas with him? He hoped I would not think this impertinent. He expected that I would be engaged already, but he could not resist the chance. Well, I wasn't engaged. Far from it. If Lunt was lonely, so was I. If Lunt was a failure, so was I. I was touched, as I have said, by his letter, and I accepted his invitation. As I went down in the train to Penzance, I wondered what kind of a man he would be. I had never seen any photographs of him. He was not the sort of author whose pictures the newspapers publish. He must be, I fancied, about my own age, perhaps rather older. I know when we're lonely how some of us are forever imagining that a friend will somewhere turn up, that ideal friend who will understand all one's feelings, who will give one affection without being sentimental, who will take an interest in one's affairs without being impertinent. Yes, the sort of friend one never finds. I fancy that I became quite romantic about Lunt before I reached Penzance. We would talk, he and I, about all those literary questions that seemed to me at that time so absorbing. We would perhaps often stay together and even travel abroad on those little journeys that are so swiftly melancholy when one is alone, so delightful when one has a perfect companion. I imagined him as sparse and delicate and refined, with a sort of wistfulness and rather childish play of fancy. We had both, so far, failed in our careers, but perhaps together we would do great things. When I arrived at Penzance it was almost dark, and the snow, threatened all day by an overhanging sky, had begun gently and timorously to fall. He had told me in his letter that a fly would be at the station to take me to his house, and there I found it, a funny old weather-beaten carriage with a funny old weather-beaten driver. At this distance of time my imagination may have created many things, but I fancy that from the moment I was shut into that carriage, some dim suggestion of fear and apprehension attacked me. I fancy that I had some absurd impulse to get out of the thing and take the night train back to London again, an action that would have been very unlike me, as I had always a sort of obstinate determination to carry through anything that I had begun. In any case, I was uncomfortable in that carriage. It had, I remember, a nasty, musty smell of damp straw and stale eggs, and it seemed to confine me so closely as though it were determined that, once I was in, I should never get out again. Then it was bitterly cold. I was colder during that drive than I have ever been before or since. It was that penetrating cold that seems to pierce your very brain, so that I could not think with any clearness, but only wish again and again that I hadn't come. Of course I could see nothing, only feel the jolt over the uneven road, and once and again we seemed to fight our way through dark paths, because I could feel the overhanging branches of the trees knock against the cab with mysterious taps, as though they were trying to give me some urgent message. Well, I mustn't make more of it than the facts allow, and I mustn't see into it all the significance of the events that followed. I only know that as the drive proceeded I became more and more miserable with the cold of my body, the misgivings of my imagination, the general loneliness of my case. At last we stopped. The old scarecrow got slowly off his box, with many heavings and sighings, came to the cab door, and with great difficulty and irritating slowness opened it. I got out of it, and found that the snow was now falling very heavily indeed, and that the path was lighted with its soft, mysterious glow. Before me was a humped and ungainly shadow, the house that was to receive me. I could make nothing of it in that darkness, but only stood there shivering while the old man pulled at the door-bell with a sort of frantic energy, as though he were anxious to be rid of the whole job as quickly as possible, and return to his own place. At last, after what seemed an endless time, the door opened, and an old man, who might have been own brother to the driver, poked out his head. The two old men talked together, and at last my bag was shouldered, and I was permitted to come in out of the piercing cold. Now this, I know, is not imagination. I have never, at any period of my life, hated at first sight so vigorously any dwelling-place into which I have entered, as I did that house. There was nothing especially disagreeable about my first vision of the hall. It was a large, dark place, lit by 2 dim lamps, cold and cheerless. But I got no particular impression of it because at once I was conducted out of it, led along a passage, and then introduced into a room which was, I saw, as warm and comfortable as the hall had been dark and dismal. I was, in fact, so eagerly pleased at the large and leaping fire that I moved towards it at once, not noting, at the first moment, the presence of my host. And when I did see him I could not believe that it was he. I have told you the kind of man that I had expected, but instead of the sparse, sensitive artist, I found facing me a large, burly man, over 6 foot, I should fancy, as broad-shouldered as he was tall, giving evidence of great muscular strength, the lower part of his face hidden by a black, pointed beard. But if I was astonished at the sight of him, I was doubly amazed when he spoke. His voice was thin and piping, like that of some old woman, and the little nervous gestures that he made with his hands were even more feminine than his voice. But I had to allow, perhaps, for excitement, for excited he was. He came up to me, took my hand in both of his, and held it as though he would never let it go. In the evening he apologized for this. "I was so glad to see you," he said. "I couldn't believe that really you would come. You are the first visitor of my own kind that I have had here for ever so long. I was ashamed indeed of asking you, but I had to snatch at the chance. It means so much to me." His eagerness, in fact, had something disturbing about it. Something pathetic, too. He simply couldn't do too much for me. He led me through funny, crumbling old passages, the boards creaking under us at every step, up some dark stairs. The walls hung, so far as I could see in the dim light, with faded yellow photographs of places, and showed me into my room with a deprecating, agitated gesture, as though he expected me at the first sight of it to turn and run. I didn't like it any more than I liked the rest of the house, but that was not my host's fault. He had done everything he possibly could for me. There was a large fire flaming in the open fireplace. There was a hot bottle, as he explained to me, in the big four-poster bed, and the old man who had opened the door to me was already taking my clothes out of my bag and putting them away. Lunt's nervousness was almost sentimental. He put both his hands on my shoulders and said, looking at me pleadingly, "If you only knew what it is for me to have you here, the talks we'll have. Well, well, I must leave you. You'll come down and join me, won't you, as soon as you can?" It was then, when I was left alone in my room, that I had my second impulse to flee. 4 candles in tall old silver candlesticks were burning brightly, and these, with the blazing fire, gave plenty of light, and yet the room was in some way dim, as though a faint smoke pervaded it, and I remember that I went to one of the old lattice windows and threw it open for a moment as though I felt stifled. 2 things quickly made me close it. One was the intense cold which, with a fluttering scamper of snow, blew into the room. The other was the quite deafening roar of the sea, which seemed to fling itself at my very face as though it wanted to knock me down. I quickly shut the window, turned round, and saw an old woman standing just inside the door. Now every story of this kind depends for its interest on its verisimilitude. Of course, to make my tale convincing, I should be able to prove to you that I saw that old woman. But I can't. I can only urge upon you my rather dreary reputation of probity. You know that I'm a teetotaler, and always have been, and, most important evidence of all, I was not expecting to see an old woman, and yet I hadn't the least doubt in the world but that it was an old woman I saw. You may talk about shadows, clothes hanging on the back of the door, and the rest of it. I don't know. I've no theories about this story. I'm not a spiritualist. I don't know that I believe in anything especially, except the beauty of beautiful things. We'll put it, if you like, that I fancied that I saw an old woman, and my fancy was so strong that I can give you to this day a pretty detailed account of her appearance. She wore a black silk dress, and on her breast was a large, ugly gold brooch. She had black hair, brushed back from her forehead and parted down the middle. She wore a collar of some white stuff round her throat. Her face was one of the wickedest, most malignant and furtive that I have ever seen, very white in colour. She was shrivelled enough now, but might once have been rather beautiful. She stood there quietly, her hands at her side. I thought that she was some kind of housekeeper. "I have everything I want, thank you," I said. "What a splendid fire!" I turned for a moment towards it, and when I looked back she was gone. I thought nothing of this, of course, but drew up an old chair covered with green faded tapestry, and thought that I would read a little from some book that I had brought down with me before I went to join my host. The fact was that I was not very intent upon joining him before I must. I didn't like him. I had already made up my mind that I would find some excuse to return to London as soon as possible. I can't tell you why I didn't like him, except that I was myself very reserved and had, like many Englishmen, a great distrust of demonstrations, especially from another man. I hadn't cared for the way in which he had put his hands on my shoulders, and I felt perhaps that I wouldn't be able to live up to all his eager excitement about me. I sat in my chair and took up my book, but I had not been reading for more than 2 minutes before I was conscious of a most unpleasant smell. Now there are all sorts of smells, healthy and otherwise, but I think the nastiest is that chilly kind of odour that comes from bad sanitation and stuffy rooms combined. You meet it sometimes at little country inns and decrepit town lodgings. This smell was so definite that I could almost locate it. It came from near the door. I got up, approached the door, and at once it was as though I were drawing near to somebody who, if you'll forgive the impoliteness, was not accustomed to taking too many baths. I drew back just as I might had an actual person been there. Then quite suddenly the smell was gone, the room was fresh, and I saw to my surprise that one of the windows had opened, and that the snow was again blowing in. I closed it and went downstairs. The evening that followed was odd enough. My host was not in himself an unlikable man. He did his very utmost to please me. He had a fine culture and a wide knowledge of books and things. He became quite cheerful as the evening went on, gave me a good dinner in a funny little dining-room hung with some admirable mezzotints. The serving-man looked after us, a funny old man with a long white beard like a goat, and, oddly enough, it was from him that I first recaught my earlier apprehension. He had just put the dessert on the table, had arranged my plate in front of me, when I saw him give a start and look towards the door. My attention was attracted to this because his hand, as it touched the plate, suddenly trembled. My eyes followed, but I could see nothing. That he was frightened of something was perfectly clear, and then, it may of course very easily have been fancy, I thought that I detected once more that strange, unwholesome smell. I forgot this again when we were both seated in front of a splendid fire in the library. Lunt had a very fine collection of books, and it was delightful to him, as it is to every book collector, to have somebody with him who could really appreciate them. We stood looking at one book after another, and talking eagerly about some of the minor early English novelists who were my especial hobby: Page, Godwin, Henry Mackenzie, Mrs. Shelley, Matt Lewis, and others, when once again he affected me most unpleasantly by putting his arm around my shoulders. I have all my life disliked intensely to be touched by certain people. I suppose we all feel like this. It is one of those inexplicable things, and I disliked this so much that I abruptly drew away. Instantly he changed into a man of furious and ungovernable rage. I thought that he was going to strike me. He stood there quivering all over, the words pouring out of his mouth incoherently, as though he were mad and didn't know what he was saying. He accused me of insulting him, of abusing his hospitality, of throwing his kindness back into his face, and of 1,000 other ridiculous things. And I can't tell you how strange it was to hear all this coming out in that shrill piping voice, as though it were from an agitated woman, and yet to see with one's eyes that big muscular frame, those immense shoulders, and that dark bearded face. I said nothing. I am physically a coward. I dislike above everything else in the world any sort of quarrel. At last I brought out, "I am very sorry. I didn't mean anything. Please forgive me," and then hurriedly turned to leave the room. At once he changed again. Now he was almost in tears. He implored me not to go, said it was his wretched temper, but that he was so miserable and unhappy, and had for so long now been alone and desolate, that he hardly knew what he was doing. He begged me to give him another chance, and if I would only listen to his story I would perhaps be more patient with him. At once, so oddly is man constituted, I changed in my feelings towards him. I was very sorry for him. I saw that he was a man on the edge of his nerves, and that he really did need some help and sympathy, and would be quite distracted if he could not get it. I put my hand on his shoulder to quieten him, and to show him that I bore no malice, and I felt that his great body was quivering from head to foot. We sat down again, and in an odd rambling manner he told me his story. It amounted to very little, and the gist of it was that, rather to have some sort of companionship than from any impulse of passion, he had married some 15 years before the daughter of a neighbouring clergyman. They had no very happy life together, and at the last he told me quite frankly he had hated her. She had been mean, overbearing, and narrow-minded. It had been, he confessed, nothing but a relief to him, when, just a year ago, she had suddenly died from heart failure. He had thought then that things would go better with him, but they had not. Nothing had gone right with him since. He hadn't been able to work. Many of his friends had ceased to come to see him. He had found it even difficult to get servants to stay with him. He was desperately lonely. He slept badly. That was why his temper was so terribly on edge. He had no one in the house with him save the old man, who was fortunately an excellent cook, and a boy, the old man's grandson. "Oh, I thought," I said, that excellent meal tonight was cooked by your housekeeper." "My housekeeper?" he answered. "There's no woman in the house." "Oh, but one came to my room," I replied, "this evening, an old ladylike-looking person in a black silk dress." "You were mistaken," he answered in the oddest voice, as though he were exerting all the strength that he possessed to keep himself quiet and controlled. "I am sure that I saw her," I answered. "There couldn't be any mistake, and I described her to him." "You were mistaken?" he repeated again. "Don't you see that you must have been when I tell you there is no woman in the house?" I reassured him quickly, lest there should be another outbreak of rage. Then there followed the strangest kind of appeal. Urgently, as though his very life depended upon it, he begged me to stay with him for a few days. He implied, although he said nothing definitely, that he was in great trouble, that if only I would stay for a few days all would be well, that if ever in all my life I had had a chance of doing a kind action, I had one now, that he couldn't expect me to stop in so dreary a place, but that he would never forget it if I did. He spoke in a voice of such urgent distress that I comforted him as I might a child, promising that I would stay, and shaking hands with him on it as though it were a kind of solemn oath between us. 2. I am sure that you would wish me to give you this incident as it occurred, and if the final catastrophe seems to come, as it were, accidentally, I can only say to you that that was how it happened. It is since the event that I have tried to put 2 and 2 together, and that they don't altogether make 4 is the fault that mine shares, I suppose, with every true ghost story. But the truth is that after that very strange episode between us, I had a very good night. I slept the sleep of all justice, cosy and warm, in my 4-poster, with the murmur of the sea beyond the windows to rock my slumbers. Next morning, too, was bright and cheerful, the sun sparkling down on the snow, and the snow sparkling back to the sun as though they were glad to see one another. I had a very pleasant morning looking at Lunt's books, talking to him and writing 1 or 2 letters. I must say that after all, I liked the man. His appeal to me on the night before had touched me. So few people, you see, had ever appealed to me about anything. His nervousness was there, and the constant sense of apprehension, yet he seemed to be putting the best face on it, doing his utmost to set me at my ease, in order to induce me to stay, I suppose, and to give him a little of that company that he so terribly needed. I dare say, if I had not been so busy about the books, I would not have been so happy. There was a strange eerie silence about that house if one ever stopped to listen, and once, I remember, sitting at the old bureau writing a letter, I raised my head and looked up, and caught Lunt watching, as though he wondered whether I had heard or noticed anything. And so I listened too, and it seemed to me as though someone were on the other side of the library door with their hand raised to knock. A quaint notion with nothing to support it, but I could have sworn that if I had gone to the door and opened it, suddenly someone would have been there. However, I was cheerful enough, and after lunch quite happy. Lunt asked me if I would like a walk, and I said I would, and we started out in the sunshine over the crunching snow towards the sea. I don't remember what we talked of. We seemed to be now quite at our ease with one another. We crossed the fields to a certain point, looked down at the sea, smooth now, like silk, and turned back. I remember that I was so cheerful that I seemed suddenly to take a happy view of all my prospects. I began to confide in Lunt, telling him of my little plans, of my hopes for the book that I was then writing, and even began rather timidly to suggest to him that perhaps we should do something together, that what we both needed was a friend of common taste with ourselves. I knew that I was talking on, that we had crossed a little village street, and were turning up the path towards the dark avenue of trees that led to his house, when suddenly the change came. What I first noticed was that he was not listening to me. His gaze was fixed beyond me, into the very heart of the black clump of trees that fringed the silver landscape. I looked too, and my heart bounded. There was, standing just in front of the trees, as though she were waiting for us, the old woman whom I had seen in my room the night before. I stopped. "Why, there she is," I said. "That's the old woman of whom I was speaking, the old woman who came to my room." He caught my shoulder with his hand. "There's nothing there," he said. "Don't you see that shadow? What's the matter with you? Can't you see that there's nothing?" I stepped forward, and there was nothing, and I wouldn't to this day be able to tell you whether it was hallucination or not. I can only say that from that moment the afternoon appeared to become dark. As we entered into the avenue of trees, silently and hurrying as though someone were behind us, the dusk seemed to have fallen so that I could scarcely see my way. We reached the house, breathless. He hastened into his study as though I were not with him, but I followed, and, closing the door behind me, said, with all the force that I had at command, "Now, what is this? What is it that's troubling you? You must tell me. How can I help you if you don't?" And he replied, in so strange a voice that it was as though he had gone out of his mind, "I tell you, there's nothing. Can't you believe me when I tell you there's nothing at all? I'm quite all right. Oh, my God, don't leave me. This is the very day, the very night," she said. "But I did nothing, I tell you. I did nothing. It's only her beastly malice." He broke off. He still held my arm with his hand. He made strange movements, wiping his forehead as though it were damp with sweat, almost pleading with me, then suddenly angry again, then beseeching once more as though I had refused him the one thing he wanted. I saw that he was truly not far from madness, and I began myself to have a sudden terror of this damp, dark house, this great, trembling man, and something more that was worse than they. But I pitied him. How could you or any man have helped it? I made him sit down in the armchair beside the fire, which had now dwindled to a few glimmering red coals. I let him hold me close to him with his arm, and clutch my hand with his, and I repeated, as quietly as I might, "But tell me, don't be afraid, whatever it is you have done. Tell me what danger it is you fear, and then we can face it together." "Fear, fear," he repeated, and then, with a mighty effort which I could not but admire, he summoned all his control. "I'm off my head," he said, "with loneliness and depression. My wife died a year ago on this very night. We hated one another. I couldn't be sorry when she died, and she knew it. When that last heart attack came on, between her gasps she told me that she would return, and I've always dreaded this night. That's partly why I asked you to come, to have someone here, anybody, and you've been very kind, more kind than I had any right to expect. You must think me insane, going on like this, but see me through tonight, and we'll have splendid times together. Don't desert me now of all times." I promised that I would not. I soothed him as best I could. We sat there, for I know not how long, through the gathering dark. We neither of us moved. The fire died out, and the room was lit with a strange dim glow that came from the snowy landscape beyond the uncurtained windows. Ridiculous, perhaps, as I look back at it. We sat there, I in a chair close to his, hand in hand, like a couple of lovers, but in real truth, two men terrified, fearful of what was coming, and unable to do anything to meet it. I think that was perhaps the queerest part of it. A sort of paralysis that crept over me. What would you or anyone else have done? Summoned the old man? Gone down to the village inn? Fetched the local doctor? I could do nothing but see the snow-shine move like trembling water about the furniture, and hear, through the urgent silence, the faint hoot of an owl from the trees in the wood. 3. Oddly enough, I can remember nothing, try as I may, between that strange vigil and the moment when I myself, wakened out of a brief sleep, sat up in bed to see Lunt standing inside my room holding a candle. He was wearing a nightshirt, and looked huge in the candlelight, his black beard falling intensely dark on the white stuff of his shirt. He came very quietly towards my bed, the candle throwing flickering shadows about the room. When he spoke it was in a voice low and subdued, almost a whisper. "Would you come?" he asked. "Only for half an hour." "Just for half an hour?" he repeated, staring at me as though he didn't know me. "I'm unhappy without somebody. Very unhappy." Then he looked over his shoulder, held the candle high above his head, and stared piercingly at every part of the room. I could see that something had happened to him, that he had taken another step into the country of fear, a step that had withdrawn him from me and from every other human being. He whispered, "When you come, tread softly. I don't want anyone to hear us." I did what I could. I got from out of bed, put on my dressing gown and slippers, and tried to persuade him to stay with me. The fire was almost dead, but I told him that we would build it up again, and that we would sit there and wait for the morning. But no, he repeated again and again. "It's better in my own room. We're safer there." "Safer from what?" I asked him, making him look at me. "Lunt, wake up. You're as though you're asleep. There's nothing to fear. We've nobody but ourselves. Stay here and let us talk, and have done with this nonsense." But he wouldn't answer, only drew me forward down the dark passage, and then turned into his room, beckoning me to follow. He got into bed and sat hunched up there, his hands holding his knees, staring at the door, and every once and again shivering with a little tremor. The only light in the room was that from the candle, now burning low, and the only sound was the purring whisper of the sea. It seemed to make little difference to him that I was there. He did not look at me, but only at the door, and when I spoke to him he did not answer me, nor seem to hear what I had said. I sat down beside the bed and, in order to break the silence, talked on about anything, about nothing, and was dropping off, I think, into a confused doze when I heard his voice breaking across mine. Very clearly and distinctly he said, "If I killed her, she deserved it. She was never a good wife to me, not from the first. She shouldn't have irritated me as she did. She clearly knew what my temper was. She had a worse one than mine, though. She can't touch me. I'm as strong as she is." And it was then, as clearly as I can now remember, that his voice suddenly sank into a sort of gentle whisper, as though he were almost glad that his fears had been confirmed. He whispered, "She's there." I cannot possibly describe to you how that whisper seemed to let fear loose, like water through my body. I could see nothing. The candle was flaming high in the last moments of its life. I could see nothing, but Lunt suddenly screamed with a shrill cry like a tortured animal in agony. "Keep her off me! Keep her away from me! Keep her off! Keep her off!" He caught me, his hands digging into my shoulders. Then, with an awful effect of constricted muscles, as though rigour had caught and held him, his arms slowly fell away. He slipped back onto the bed as though someone were pushing him. His hands fell against the sheet. His whole body jerked with a convulsive effort, and then he rolled over. I saw nothing, only quite distinctly in my nostrils was the same fetid odour that I had known on the preceding evening. I rushed to the door, opened it, shouted down the long passage again and again, and soon the old man came running. I sent him for the doctor, and then could not return to the room, but stood there listening, hearing nothing save the whisper of the sea, the loud ticking of the hall clock. I flung open the window at the end of the passage. The sea rushed in with its precipitant roar. Some bells chimed the hour. Then at last, beating into myself more courage, I turned back towards the room. "Well?" I asked as Runciman paused. "He was dead, of course?" "Dead. The doctor afterwards said of heart failure." "Well?" I asked again. "That's all." Runciman paused. I don't know whether you can even call it a ghost story. My idea of the old woman may have been all hallucination. I don't even know whether his wife was like that when she was alive. She may have been large and fat. Lunt died of an evil conscience. "Yes," I said. "The only thing," Runciman added at last, after a long pause, "is that on Lunt's body there were marks, on his neck especially, some on his chest, as of fingers pressing in, scratches and dull blue marks. He may, in his terror, have caught at his own throat." "Yes," I said again. "Anyway," Runciman shivered, "I don't like Cornwall. Beastly county. Queer things happen there. Something in the air."